Hello. Sorry for starting late. Between last night and now, I managed to flush out one of my fillings. I am not in the best state, so hopefully that won't hinder us too much. But we are continuing with Rousseau. Not with Rousseau, rather. We were continuing with de Maestre. Is my audio clear? Let me know if you can hear me. If you can't, that's going to be a bit of a drag. Is de Maestre going to argue that we should reject Rousseau's humanity and return to monkey? I think de Maestre is a literalist when it comes to the book of Genesis, so I don't think he believes that we can return to monkey because we were never there. Audio's fine? Good. Okay. Yeah, if you noticed, I kept, adjusting my mouth yesterday. That's because my jaw was killing me. And apparently, that was because I was grinding my teeth in my sleep so badly that I was actually ripping out my fillings. That's not good. Alright. Anyways. If the audio is a bit low, that might literally just be me because I am talking very quietly. Let me see if I turn the gain up, if that helps a little bit. Okay. So anyways, so we got about 10 pages in last time. Let's find out where we were. I bookmarked it. Oh, and this is kind of cool. So the first of my two Cambridge editions of Rousseau finally came in. Lewis from Perspective Philosophy says he hates the new Cambridge Blue Book covers. I kind of like them, actually. This is the discourses, including the one that de Maestre is going to be responding to directly here, specifically the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality, and some other early writings. But yeah, I really do like the art in this covers. It's much better, because this is what they used to look like. For anyone who's not familiar, they used to look like this, which, is fine, but it's kind of bland. I like these. I like these, elemental covers they have. They still keep the blueness to it. They still look professional, but significantly more interesting. I'm a little bit ambiguous on the Hegel's Philosophy of Right one. It looks kind of like a draining pool. I still like it, but I don't know what exactly went into that decision. There, I just gave you all COVID. Alright, so anyways, so I've got that. We're probably not going to be referencing that today, but it's there. I think by the time we come to the end of this book, or wherever we would choose to leave off, I might do a final stream where I take... I actually go through Rousseau, because this volume is actually really useful, because it comes with Rousseau's responses to his critics, specifically the second discourse. So I might go through and try to bring those to bear on what we've read in de Maestre's critique. Let's find where we left off. I did underline, but did I fail to save it? I may have failed to save it. But we got to here. We finished off with, when we say that nature alone has closed a wound without the help of surgery, if they ask us what we mean by this expression, what do we answer? Either we speak without understanding ourselves, or we have the idea of a force, of a power, of a principle, and to speak clearly, of a being who works for the preservation of our body and whose action was sufficient to close the wound without the help of art. Now this is, of course, if we're speaking in broader terms than, simply the individual organism, there's a teleology to nature here that is very consistent with a lot of Christian thinking about the, I guess, reason in nature, if you want to be really loose with that term, or with the sort of a directionality towards, kind of like a design principle, sort of. Whereas Rousseau is arguing effectively that the way the human being is, and you could extend this to all animals, he even makes a nod towards Aristotle's conjecture that nails were once claws and things like that. So a very old evolutionary idea. But the general idea of Rousseau is that human beings are formed by history. We are not formed all at once like a single work of art. So we are now going into de Maestre's arguments concerning nature. I feel a bit of a cough coming on, so I might have to cut this early if I can't speak, but we'll try. So again, concerning nature as a force. However, this force that acts in us acts as well in all the animals, from the elephant to the mite, and in all the plants, from the cedar to the moss, because nothing is isolated in the world, and nothing can exist as an independent force. Either it is necessary that all these individual principles are related to a general cause that embraces everything and that uses them as pure instruments, or it is necessary that this great cause, this plastic nature itself, acts in all individuals in such a way that we regard particular forces as only the particular action of a general principle. There is no other supposition to make, so therefore either God acts immediately in the universe, or he acts by the intermediary of an immaterial and single power that in its turn acts immediately or by the intermediary of certain principles that exist outside it. Whatever the nature of these principles, it is certain that they execute the will of the infinite intelligence either indirectly or directly. Thus, in naming them, we name it. Thus in naming them, we name it. The totality of pieces that compose the whole must have a name, and commonly enough we give it that of nature, especially in speaking of the world we inhabit. It is in this sense that we say that there are no two beings in nature that resemble each other perfectly. By a completely natural analogy, we also give the name nature to the assemblage of parts or qualities that compose any whole, although this whole is itself only a part of the larger great whole. I don't like this characterization, and I don't have a very I would like to get a better understanding of sort of the history of this notion of the nature of a thing. But I don't think when we talk about nature, we talk about the whole of a thing. I think sometimes what we're talking about rather is, we may speak of tendencies, for example, or ends, like in a teleological sense, which doesn't by itself refer again to the whole of the thing, because the thing may simply be an activity. And so when we're talking about the whole of a thing, we're talking about a domain of activity. But not necessarily the whole of any one individual creature, right? Because those can be defective, they can be injured, they can be dead, things like that. And thus we say the nature of man, of horses, of elephants, of gold, of silver, of linden trees, of roses, of watches. See, there you go, right there. So we know from the example of the watch that he is talking of objects and of fire engines. He is talking about the whole of an individual expression of a type, not of the type itself or of a species. So he's not talking about the whole as in terms of like a process. That you could sustain. He's talking about the whole in terms of the thing itself. But the nature of a human being is not to have, for example, every limb or every organ intact at a given time, or to be at a certain peak age at a given time. No, that is subject to almost infinite mutation. If we want to talk about the whole of a human being in any sense that has any significance beyond, again, this particular instantiation being intact, we can't be again, like invoking characteristics of a specific individual. We have to be talking about that individual's role in a process, or as an activity rather. 4. Finally, man, being an agent whose action extends over everything he can reach, he has the power to modify a host of beings, and to modify himself. Therefore, one needs a way of describing these beings before and after they have sustained human action. From this point of view, we generally oppose nature to art, which is human power, as we specifically oppose the wild plant to the grafted plant. Which is a little bit strange, then. He would refer to the nature of watches and fire engines, which are products of art. So maybe you'll clarify that coming up. Therefore, one can understand by the word nature, 1, the divine action manifested in the universe, 2. Some cause acting under the direction of the first. 3. The totality of parts or qualities forming by their union a system of things or an individual being. That's confusing. A system of things or an individual being, these are categorically different things. And 4. The state of a being capable of being modified by human action before it has undergone this modification. After these preliminary explanations, we can reason on the state of nature, and if we have the misfortune of being mistaken, at least we will not have the misfortune of being misunderstood. Fair enough. The state of nature, says Pufendorf, is not the condition that nature proposes to itself principally as the most perfect and most suitable to the human race. And elsewhere, the state of nature pure and simple is not the state to which nature has destined man. Which is to say that the state of nature is against nature. Or in other words, that nature does not want men to live in the state of nature. Yeah, and so we derive a teleological principle effectively from Hobbes, which is the grand irony of the thing, of course. Because he again derives the emergence of the state historically, whether or not he does so with sort of circumspect ahistoricality or not. But because the emergence of the state is directly from our natural rights, namely our natural right to everything and sort of the contradictions that result therefrom, in that by having a right to everything, in effect, we, by the mutual danger we put ourselves in, we end up having access to practically nothing or very little. We can't develop or build or whatnot because there's so much danger and so much uncertainty and so few protections that there's nothing to sort of give us faith in the future, such that we will make long-term commitments to build up for the future, things like that. And so indeed you do find that the state of nature for human beings, at least under Hobbes, is against nature, because we seem to be preconfigured to arise out of it. Now crucially, Hobbes is reading people in his present time backwards into time, into a conjectured prehistory prior to any form of civilization, of course. Now Rousseau actually modifies this in a somewhat more realist way, despite the fact that he explicitly begins his essay by saying that we are going to start by setting aside all of the facts. We're going to conjecture based on what we have now into what must have happened to get here. But he points out that, actually, our pre-civilizational history must be very, very long indeed, longer than civilizational history. And indeed, we see not just these dangerous characteristics that are prevalent in the modern era. We can also recognize that we have characteristics that would, in and of themselves, even without the protections of modernity, keep us from living in a state of a state of war, as Hobbes puts it. And that furthermore, civilization or society or modernity or sort of this, the level of social progress, quote unquote, of course we're talking about Rousseau, that has hitherto taken place, has itself been the functional cause of a lot of these characteristics that would make us in a state of war, in a state of nature. To return to Maestre. The wording of this proposition is a little strange, but it is not surprising. It suffices to be understood. So what is this pure and simple state of nature that is against nature? It is that where we conceive each person finding himself... He's quoting from Pufendorf, I see. It is that where we conceive each person finding himself as he was born, without all the inventions and all the purely human or divinely inspired establishments, by which we understand not only the diverse sorts of arts with all the general commodities of life, but also civil societies whose formation is the principal source of the good order we see among men. In a word, man in the state of nature is a man fallen from the clouds. Pufendorf is right, ordinary usage opposing the state of nature to the state of civilization. It is clear that man in the first state is only man, less all that he has from the institutions that surround him in the second state, which is to say, a man who is not a man. I cite this distinguished jurisconsult, although he is no longer in fashion, because he expresses ideas that are in nearly all heads, and that it is only a question of developing. Nature is only a question of developing, I take him to mean here. Clearly, in the text cited, the word nature cannot be taken in the third sense that I have given respecting usage. That is to say, for the whole of the pieces and forces constituting the system of the world, for the whole is a work and not a worker. That's a strange sentence. A work and not a worker. Now, my immediate thought here, I don't want to be like petty about this, but he just finished saying that when we describe again the particulars of nature, because again he is invoking a kind of intelligent, what we would call intelligent design. When we name those things, we are in fact naming the agent behind them as well. So in effect, in a sense at least, the whole is also the worker insofar as we name it and infer from it sort of the expressions of a worker, but like the demiurge in the Timaeus literally means worker. So one can only take the word nature in the first two senses insofar as it expresses not worker, it means like forger or something like that, like a craftsman. Because of course Plato divides, he theoretically divides the world into three substances. There's, well, we call substances. There's matter. There's like this infinite changing, the constantly changing matter that is eternal, but is constantly in flux. And then there are the eternal forms, these perfect shapes and values or whatever. And then there is the demiurge who molds the matter in accordance with his observation of the forms. But moving on. So one can only take the word nature in the first two senses insofar as it expresses an action, and in the fourth sense insofar as it expresses a state. In effect, when one says that nature destines or does not destine a particular being to a particular state, the word nature necessarily awakens the idea of an intelligence and a will. When Pufendorf says that the state of nature is against nature, he is not contradicting himself. He only gives two different meanings to the same word. In the first case, the word signifies a state, and in the second, it signifies a cause. In the first case, it is taken for the exclusion of art and civilization, and in the second, for the action of some agent. Moreover, as in an equation, one of the members can always be taken for the other, since they are equal. Likewise, the word nature, every time that it expresses an action, can only express that of the divine action, manifested immediately or by the intermediary of some secondary agent. It follows that without changing values, one can always substitute the value God for that of nature. The proposition is thus reduced to this: the state of nature is not a state to which God has destined man. This is a very clear and most reasonable proposition. I would reply it stands only as a proposition, and I haven't seen a whole lot of reason towards it. And we'll go back and look at why. Let's highlight this, though, so we know where to come back to. So, the state of nature is not a state to which God has destined man. Now he says that 1 and 2 are the consistent ones. Let's see, where's the shorter? Nope. We'll just continue. I'm sure it'll come up again. There is no absurdity, said Cicero, that has not been maintained, he could have added, and no truth that has not been denied by some philosopher. That's rude. Once it pleased the Epicureans, then their disciple Lucretius, and in our time Rousseau, to maintain that man is not a social being. However, Lucretius is much more moderate than Rousseau. The first contents himself with maintaining that, all things considered, the state of nature has no more drawbacks than that of association. Well, the citizen of Geneva, Rousseau famously signed off his texts as a citizen of Geneva. So he's mocking him here. While the citizen of Geneva, who never stops on the road of error, maintains flatly that society is an abuse, and he's written a book to prove it. This is a strange characterization. Man is not a social being. I don't think Rousseau says that man is not a social being, because he's quite explicit that one of the things that keep us from being at each other's throats and being in the Hobbesian state of war, in a state of nature, is that we have eminently social characteristics built into our psychology. We are empathetic. We have a response to when we have an instinct to help when fellow members of our species are crying, for example. We also inherently fear the revenge of other members of our species should we attempt to take their things or hurt them in some way. So we are eminently social. Now, that being said, we are in a state of nature more spread out. We aren't competing for resources. He sort of seems to assume abundance. I don't think he says that man is not a social being at all. Now, society is different from the social. Society refers to a body within a community that is comprised of human beings that have been, in some sense, flattened into a single kind of relation. Which is why we only have the concept of society fairly recently in our history, because we didn't talk about society in ancient Athens. We talked about the community between different classes, between citizens, but we didn't talk about this amorphous mass that was simply all people, or all not even all people, but all thinking, speaking beings in a conglomerate. Marcus Aurelius was not of this opinion when he said that a being is social by the same token that it is reasonable. Rousseau, however, goes back to the source to dismiss the emperor-philosopher's sophism, and he wisely remarks that the man who meditates is a depraved animal. Elsewhere, he clearly opposes the state of nature to the state of reasoning. Okay. However, Rousseau makes a remarkable admission on the subject of inequality of conditions, that is to say, of society. Religion, he says, commands us to believe that since God himself took men out of the state of nature, immediately after the creation, they are unequal because he wanted them to be so. But it does not forbid us to form conjectures, drawn solely from the nature of man and the beings surrounding him, about what the human race might have become if it had remained abandoned to itself. This is to say that Rousseau's book is made to know what might have become of the human race if there were no God, or if men had acted without his knowledge. This phrase is a question. That's strange. This is to say that Rousseau's book is made to know what might have become of the human race if there were no God. Oh, I see. That is a question. So that punctuation is strange. You typically wouldn't add a question mark there. Society existed by the definition of its meaning even before the word society was used to describe it? Yeah, sure. I would say it did. However, that does not mean that it always existed. It's a bit confusing because we often use the word society today as a synonym for community or politeia or even country or state. But it means something very different, very specific. And by the way, on that note, I do notice a lot of the time that when I try to parse out the specific meanings of things, quote unquote, of these terms, that people object. Well, hang on, language is use, right? Why are you saying that this isn't what these words mean? This is how people use the word. Okay, fair enough, and in a certain context that makes sense. However, when you're doing political theory and all of these things have to fit together in order to be compatible pieces of a single theory of a coherent theory of politics or of the constitution of of a community, then it's important to point out when there are contradictions or overlaps, such that our use of some terms implies a necessarily different meaning of others. So I will readily admit that any of these terms can be used in any way that we like. They're just locutions. They're just sounds. We assign meaning to them by our usage of them. However, our usage of other terms and the way in which those terms implicate our usage of that term, that has force too. Does that make sense? So, for example, if our concepts, religion and politics, or religion and law, or law and politics, if we use those in such a way that they overlap with one another and impinge on each other so that we are no longer talking about distinct things, one of those things, or all of them, has to be retracted or adjusted. Does that make sense? And so that's the point to specifying the meaning of these terms. Because there is a continuous usage of them that defies a lot of common usage today. And if we want to insist on common usage today, then we need to have a very strong argument in favor of it, against historical use. I don't think there is one in a lot of cases. There are cases where there are, but yeah. All right. Here, it must be admitted, is a very useful book. Voltaire, whose heart was... oh, that's just so mean. Voltaire, whose heart was worthless, but whose head was perfectly sane, did very well to reply to this book only with a joke. What was that joke? Quote from Voltaire, "One acquires the desire to walk on all fours when one reads your work," referring to Rousseau. "Nevertheless, since I lost this habit more than 60 years ago," etc. You know what's kind of funny? When you look at reactionary writings, they tend to have sort of this austere, like where they're not sort of, and de Maestre is of a higher caliber, to be sure, than reactionaries living today, but they tend to be very austere, very grandiose. They're all about sort of ennobling things and, doing away with any sort of ennobling discourse, yada, yada, yada. But it's inherently non-conservative. When you actually look at historical conservatives, like, here's a question for you. Who do you... Karl Popper characterizes Plato as a totalitarian. Who do you suppose in ancient Athens was a conservative? Was it Plato? No, Plato was a revolutionary, at least in theory. He wanted new states run by entirely new modes of government, new I'm using the word government badly, new laws, an entire restructuring of the community, the equality of the sexes, things like that. He wanted a radical reorganization of society. The ones who were conservative, were like significantly more talented ancient Athenian Nick Fuentes, Aristophanes, comedians, playwrights, but not austere like Sophocles and whatnot, like people who specifically wrote giant phalluses as part of the costume of these characters, fart jokes, things like that. Plato wanted the equality of the sexes. Oh yeah, if you read the Republic, the guardian class, Socrates in the Republic argues quite explicitly that there is no actual distinction in terms of physical or mental capacity inherent to men or women between the two of them, and so they would be allotted with silver or gold status based on ability, based on promise, things like that. And in fact, he even did away with monogamy so that there wouldn't be the ownership of wives anymore like it took place in Athens. The cold and exquisite reason of this famous man had a horror of these inflated declamations, this eloquent nonsense 1,000 times more unbearable than the innocent platitudes of men without pretensions. Before examining if man is made or is not made for society, we cannot be dispensed from observing that this question, like all questions that can be raised about morality and politics, only makes sense in the system of theism or spiritualism. That is to say, in the system of a superior intelligence whose plans can be contradicted by the free agents of a lower order. In effect, if there is no original intention, and if all that exists is only the result of a chain of blind causes, everything is necessary. There is neither choice, nor morality, nor good, nor evil. He's putting his finger on something, isn't he? See, the Maestre's not stupid. He just doesn't understand what he's doing. You're seeing right here the seeds of the seeds of a Hegelian concept of history. Ultimately, the idea that effectively we have sort of packed into our nature, to use that term loosely, all of our future developments that just have to be unfolded over time. Rousseau, who abused all words, abused the word nature to a disgusting degree. On every page of the Discourse on Inequality of Conditions, he uses it without defining it. He makes it mean anything he wants. He provokes common sense. There's a note here. I wonder if it's actually true. I have not read this in the longest time, so... The following paragraph... Oh, I see, it continues. The following paragraph is deleted in the manuscript. The mania of the philosophers of this century is to separate men from the divinity, making abstraction, they say, of all religious ideas. This is as if they said, in speaking of man, let us make abstraction from man, for man who is an intelligent being is a relation of the divinity. He is made by it and for it. He cannot be considered separate from his source. The passage was probably deleted here because it did not fit the context. Maestre will express the same idea in later works, especially the St. Petersburg dialogues. Maybe we'll go to that at some point in the future. By the way, I characterize Aristophanes as significantly more talented than Nick Fuentes. Don't take that too deeply. Aristophanes is actually very worth giving a look to. The clouds in particular, they're very revealing of... Because when we think of ancient, social categories, their perceptions of each other, things like that, the context in which serious philosophers lived back then, it won't do to just take the interpretations of those philosophers because they had their own bias. For example, when we talk about sophists, Plato gave the term sophist a specifically derogatory connotation. Now, it did have a derogatory connotation in ancient Athens as well. These are people who taught people rhetoric so they could manipulate the assembly, and they gave rich students a superpower compared to poorer ones who couldn't afford the same quality of rhetorical tutelage. Now, Plato will come to characterize sophists as essentially fake philosophers, people who are effective in pretending to have philosophical wisdom, but in fact only are able to sort of present the seeming of philosophical wisdom. And so they can make money and aggrandize themselves by it, but they don't actually conduce to knowledge. Now, however, if we're being super technical, Socrates himself was also a sophist, not in the Platonic sense of being a fake. He was very legitimate. However, a sophist is one who purveys in wisdom. And that is all. And philosophers can be sophists on that sense. They can be people who, again, make their living, or as maybe a hobby, purvey in wisdom. That is the activity in which they take part. Which is why, again, Socrates is characterized as a sophist in Aristophanes' play of the Clouds, and that in itself isn't taken as a specifically derogatory characterization of Socrates. Socrates is just a member of a type, of a sophist, of which there are many. What disparages Socrates is that he is interested in, crawling around in stuff under the ground. He's interested in, dissecting corpses and, atheistic practices of questioning the validity or the virtue of the gods, things like that. In other words, sort of things that destabilize or diminish Athenian religious culture, or something like that. However, it sometimes happens that he, referring to Rousseau, encounters truth by chance, but always without wanting to seize it. Quote, now without a serious study of man, he says, one will never succeed. In separating in the present constitution of things what divine will has done from what human art has pretended to do. One will never succeed in separating in the present constitution of things what divine will has done from what human art has pretended to do. Okay. I'm going to read this paragraph and get some more tea. The pollen here is just absolutely killing me. First, if human art had only pretended to do it, it has done nothing, and so God's work remains in its integrity. But let us not quibble over words with a man who uses them so poorly, and let us assume that he said what he wanted to say. So it is a question of distinguishing in man what the divine will has done and what human art has done. Okay. I'm going to grab some more tea. We're going to resume from here. I'll just be a minute. Alright, back. Okay. So it is a question of distinguishing in man what the divine will has done and what human art has done. But what is human art? Nature was not enough. Here again is another power that Rousseau personifies in his anti-philosophic language that he introduces onto the scene. If human art is not perfectibility, I do not know what Rousseau wanted to say. The beaver, the bee, and other animals also deploy an art very well in the way they lodge and nourish themselves, so is it also necessary to write books to distinguish for each of these animals. So is it also necessary to write books to distinguish for each of these animals what the divine will has done and what animal art has done? They will say, however, that the art of an animal is purely mechanical. It does today what it did yesterday, while the art of man is so variable in its conceptions that it is susceptible to more or less within a range of which it is impossible to assign the limits. Now, here's the thing. There are two comments I want to make about this. First of all, obviously, there is a difference in that an animal, or non-human animals, as far as we are aware, there is tool use in certain animals, but they don't conceive of the use they've made of things and plan to do it better and experiment to do it better with the intention of doing it better, for the most part, as far as we are aware. That's one. And so we will have a genealogy of these conscious sort of artistic developments that beavers and bees and other animals like that won't have. Even if indeed these are also political animals in Aristotle's usage. They are communities that form little fortresses around which those communities are oriented. Of course, in Aristotle it's more abstract than that. There are political animals in Aristotle that don't have those fortresses, but they do have herds sometimes. But more to the point, we actually know that there is, in fact, an historical genealogical trajectory of change in the arts, as it were, of animals. We know that they evolved via various processes to begin to make these constructions, to use tools, to build things, to organize in certain ways, things like that. So, again, it's kind of interesting. So this is one of the problems with reactionary thinking as a general rule. It's not stupid. That's a mistake. I think it's backwards because, again, it's reacting, but he is following Rousseau sort of unconsciously. Like he is figuring out what Rousseau is doing, but he cannot allow it. Because because the correct answer to a lot of his questions, which he asks rhetorically, mockingly, is yes. Yeah, we're using the word art fairly loosely here. Need to not grab my teacup by the... What do you call that? By the drum? Or by the cup part, I guess. They will say, however, that the art of... this is not the place to dispute the nature of animals. It is sufficient to observe that the art of the animal differs from that of man, that the latter is perfectible, while the other is not. Now, to simplify the question, let us imagine a single man on the earth who has lived as long as the whole human race, and who unites in himself all the faculties developed successively by all men. From the nature of things, he could not have been created an infant, since he would not have been able to survive. So he possessed at birth all the strength of an adult man and even some of our acquired knowledge. Otherwise, he would have died of hunger before he was able to discover the use of his mouth. Interesting. I assume, therefore, that this man, suffering from the unseasonable air, takes shelter in a cave. Up to this point, he is still a natural man. However, if finding the cave too small, he decides to extend it by weaving some branches supported by posts at the entrance. This is incontestably art. Then he ceases to be a natural man. Does this roof of foliage pertain to the divine will or to human art? Rousseau would probably have maintained that the man was already corrupted by this time. Read the extravagant lines that begin the Emile. You will see there that everything, quote, everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. He forces one soil to nourish the products of another, one tree to bear the fruit of another. He turns everything upside down. He disfigures everything. He loves deformity, monsters, etc. Following this, and you will see that it is an abuse to cook an egg. As soon as one opposes human art to nature, one does not know when to stop. It is perhaps as far from the cave to the cabin as from the cabin to the Corinthian column. And as everything is artificial in man, in his quality as an intelligent and perfectible being, it follows that in denying him everything that comes from art, one denies him everything. I don't think necessarily that would be Rousseau's implication. Let's go back to the shelter in the cave analogy. I assume, therefore, that this man suffering from the unseasonable air takes shelter in a cave. Up to this point, he is still a natural man. However, if finding the cave too small, he decides to extend it by weaving some branches supported by posts at the entrance, this is incontestably art. Yes, but I think de Maestre is missing the point here. That natural man already found the cave that he had chosen to be too small. Yet, presumably, this is the first cave. He chose it for its, he chose it because he found it comfortable. To find it too small, I mean, that's sort of, like, no doubt, perhaps in his travels he finds other caves that he prefers, and then he starts to develop a taste for larger caves, but that's the point, is that you are conditioned by your technology to need the thing that up till then you had been without. So you cease to be a natural man then, because now your tastes are not natural. Now your tastes are dictated by your technological progress hitherto. Does that make sense? Was Rousseau alive to respond to this? I don't think Maestre understands Rousseau well. I actually don't know. I don't believe Rousseau responded to de Maestre. Let's look at the timelines here. No, Rousseau would have been dead long before this. So he died 1821, de Maestre did. It was born 1753, and Rousseau... It depends. Let me find out how old de Maestre was when he wrote this. I think he was getting up there. Against Rousseau. Oh, excuse me. No, Rousseau would not have been alive for this. This was written in 1795, well after Rousseau was dead. And I believe Voltaire long predeceased Rousseau as well. I realized just as I was starting to search for it that, of course Rousseau wasn't alive to respond to that. De Maestre was alive during the Revolution. As soon as one opposes human art to nature, one does not know when to stop. It follows that in denying him everything that comes from art, one denies him everything. Burke said with a profundity that is impossible to admire enough that art is man's nature. We're going to go through Burke at some point in the near future, too. I originally had a long, for those of you who have been at the channel for a while, I had a long schedule for the year where I was going to cover all these different thinkers, and just it practically became infeasible just because I had so many, I wasn't taking into account stuff that sort of just comes up, and video essays take a long time to do. So I think we're going to go through these thinkers sort of in this format, and that will furnish us, of course, and with you the proof that I've actually done my research, that will sort of furnish us with material for applying that to other things later on, in video essay form and otherwise. But yeah, we'll do Burke at some point in the near future as well. Burke said with profundity that art is man's nature. Here is a great saying that contains more truth and wisdom than the works of 20 philosophers of my acquaintance. All right. It is no light undertaking, Rousseau says again, to separate what is original from what is artificial in the present nature of man, and to know correctly a state which no longer exists, which perhaps never existed. Art is man's nature. So this commits you, of course, to a theistic understanding of human beings as being created fully formed in the image of God, or something along those lines. Because if art is man's nature, then we should have an infinite regress back to the creation of artistic developments, which we do not. Evolutionarily speaking, there is a period in which we started engaging in artistic creation, and there was a period before which we didn't. So, if art is man's nature, then that is actually the cutoff from a different species or a different kind that is not man, but is nonetheless our ancestor, whose nature was not art. And therefore we still again fall into something that's entirely compatible with Rousseau's stance on this. Maestre would have found the statement in Burke's Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs. Maestre used the same citation in his On the Sovereignty of the People. That'd be an interesting one to look at. It is no light undertaking, Rousseau says again, to separate what is original from what is artificial in the present nature of man, and to know correctly a state which no longer exists, which perhaps never existed. This last supposition is the simple truth, and it must be admitted that nothing is more difficult to know well than a state that never existed. It is absurd to imagine that the Creator had given a being faculties that it must never develop, and still more absurd to assume that some being can give itself faculties or utilize faculties that it has received to establish an order of things contrary to the will of the Creator. The morality of human actions consists in what man can do for good or evil in the order in which he is placed, but not at all in his being able to change this order, for we sense well enough that all essences are invariable. Thus it depends on man to do good or evil in society, but not to be social or asociable. Right. The morality of human actions consists in what man can do for good or evil in the order in which he is placed. Man is placed in an order on this frame. Again, created fully formed with all these capacities, nothing, the order in which he is placed, the order he creates does not also create him back, right? Yes, does that make sense? So later on, this is going to come up in Rousseau's Social Contract, but also in Hegel and Kant. They're going to talk about how the society or the community that we are a part of and contribute to also makes us. It is also the condition of our actualization as full human beings. And what is a full human being is going to be subject to a constant process of development. As we become more circumspect, we become more advanced, we become more powerful, things like that. I see there's an extended conversation about comedy going on in the chat. That's funny. Thus, it depends on man to do good or evil in society, but not to be social or asociable. So this is what Hegel might call a one-sided analysis. So we simply have a society in which we are in, and we simply it's just the environment, and that's the environment that we act in, and that's all. There's no talk, however, of how the environment is itself formed. Formed at the bottommost level by our actions in that environment or by our actions outside of it. Because, of course, to go back to Hobbes even, once we perform the social contract, once we enter into society, we are no longer the same kind of thing as we were before. We are now conditioned to expect the goods of that society, as well as its evils. We we are accustomed to the attitudes it engenders in us, that we would not have become accustomed to if we had never been in that situation in the first place. And so when, again, Hobbes is reading into the state of nature, human beings as they are now, he is imposing very non-natural man into nature. Rousseau is trying to take this into account, and he knows that he can't do so perfectly. So Rousseau is much more a philosopher of education. This is actually something that goes all the way back to Plato, where, again, the basis of Plato's attempt to consciously, or proposed process for altering the nature of a body of citizens is to eliminate history, to do away with all of the old poetry, all of the old writings about the gods, yada yada yada, to impose a new one, so that when you raise those people under that new noble lie, they are now different kinds of things than would have been developed otherwise. Therefore, there has never been a state of nature in Rousseau's sense, because there has never been a time when there was no human art. If one wants to call state of nature the state where the human race was when human industry had made only a few hesitant steps, well and good, it suffices to understand it this way. But it always remains demonstrated that in the process of the human race towards perfection, progress that occurred by imperceptible nuances, it is impossible to draw a philosophic line separating one from the other. Okay. Because there's never been a time when there was no human art, but there clearly was. We know there was. And indeed, art is a thing that is done in time, so there must have been a first art, right? Almost definitionally. Especially on a young Earth view. Or on a creationist view. There would have been a time, at least, when there was a single fully formed human being that performed the first work of art in the fully human sense. Now, there seems to be a bit of a bait and switch here. So there was no human art, and yet, if one wants to call a state of nature the state where the human race was when human industry had made only a few small hesitant steps, well and good. Excuse me. Yeah, these are incompatible statements. A few small hesitant steps from where? If indeed there is progress of the human race towards perfection, if there is a point at which we started moving forward, right? Like we're talking about steps, like a limited quantity of movements, of specific discrete movements. There must have been a first one. It would be a contradiction to say that there wasn't. It is impossible to draw a philosophic line separating one state from the other. No, I don't think there is. However, I don't think the first one is philosophical at all. It's theistic. The idea that there was always human art, it conjectures that human beings not only were simply always as they have been, but that from the very first they were artistic. I don't know how you could sustain that. I don't know how you could sustain that unless you're committed to a view that Adam was created as a full human being with language to name all the animals and things like that. But we know that that's not the case. And this doesn't answer Rousseau's charge that this is not the case. So to say that there's never a state of nature in Rousseau's sense I don't think that follows. I would definitely say there must be modifications. I don't think Rousseau got this 100% correctly. He was still reading into his fellow human beings, but this doesn't work. Doesn't Rousseau's conception of the state of nature end when private property was established? Not exactly. There are different degrees of inequality that can emerge before property, right? Like in nomadic tribes, there can be identified differences and ideals rather concerning beauty, physicality, yada yada. And we're not so much in the state of nature then. Now, it's less removed from the state of nature. It is a difference of degree, but you're not necessarily any more. Well, I mean, you're less unnatural in a certain respect, but you're still not a natural human being. I'm confused about Rousseau. I think he believes in quote-unquote owning land, like he's okay with that. So, crucially, Rousseau is not about actually returning to the state of nature. Rousseau is the philosopher of the state. Remember, Rousseau is the one who says that man can be forced to be free, or man must be forced to be free. His ideal is the small polis state, right? Geneva or Athens or something like that. In a certain respect, him and Onwards and Hegel and they take a very Aristotelian view of sort of a political ideal. Rousseau is critiquing society. He's not critiquing politics or even necessarily land ownership. He is drawing a genealogy from land ownership to now. In the ideal state governed by the general will, or ruled by the general will, or what have you, we are free because we are the author of its laws. It is a corporate entity in which we are a part, and in which we find our freedom through its action, right? In a very similar sense to the Aristotelian politeia, in which citizens rule and are ruled in turn. So they are free in the sense that they are the author of the polis's, or are joint authors, if you will, of the polis's actions. Sorptive says, I think art is made through mediation, so if you were to accept Terence Deacon's argument in The Symbolic Species, and believe that art can only be made meaningful symbolically, then perhaps the origins of art and humanity are one. I'll have to look into that. That sounds kind of interesting. I like that Terence uses Peirce's icon index symbol trichotomy, by the way. Jalma would find that interesting. Jalma's actually a Peirce scholar. Alright, we're almost at the end of this section. 10 more pages. The animal finds everything that it needs at hand. It does not have the power to appropriate the beings that surround it and to modify them for its use. Man, on the contrary, finds under his hands for his enjoyment only raw materials, and it is up to him to perfect them. Everything resists his animal power. Everything bends to his intelligence. He writes his titles of grandeur on the three realms of nature, and the man who has received eyes to read them is exalted to ecstasy. So human art, or perfectibility, being the nature of man, or the quality that constitutes him what he is by the will of the Creator, it follows that when one asks what in man pertains to the divine will, and what pertains to human art, it is just as if one asked, what in man comes from the divine will or from the nature that is his by the divine will? It follows when one asks what in man pertains to the divine will. Okay. So human art is the nature of man or the quality that constitutes him what he is. This phrasing is so weird. What he is by the will of the Creator. Okay. But Rousseau who represents the state of nature for us as that where man did not reason, and where he remained abandoned to himself, where, quote, not having among themselves any kind of moral relations or known duties, could be neither good nor evil, where dispersed among the animals, scattered in the woods, having neither fixed domicile nor any need of one another, without knowing each other. Is that a... I want to make sure that's not a misquote. Without knowing each other, 55. That could be just a quotable part. Um... 55. Oh, must be from part 1. There we go. Oh, there aren't 55 parts in part 1. I don't know what the notation is here. That is strange. Uh, 53, page 63, 334. Yeah, here we go. Nope. Anyways, I won't waste your time with that. We'll just take the quote at face value. Having neither fixed domicile nor any need of one another, without knowing each other, where violence and oppression were impossible, this Rousseau, I say, had begun by advancing that it was violence and oppression that put at an end to the state of nature. What he reels off above is so strange that it is necessary to reread it twice to believe one's eyes. Well, that checks out. Precisely what, then, says Rousseau, is at issue in this discourse? To indicate in the progress of things the moment when, right taking the place of violence, nature was subjected to law, to explain by what sequence of marvels the strong could resolve to serve the weak, and the people to buy a repose in ideas at the price of real felicity. There's something almost Nietzschean here, isn't there? This is effectively a genealogy of morals. Or is doing something similar to the genealogy of morals. Right taking the place of violence, nature was subjected to law. And he locates this in property. This checks out historically. Because again, to go back to what we were talking about in the previous streams, what we translate as law, or the basis of the constitution of Athens, or of ancient polises generally, was nomos. It was the concrete division of the territory into properties, into fixed parts, right? And that formed the spatial, concrete constitution of what became the polis. Then men were no longer scattered, although in the state of nature they were nevertheless united in society. But violence was introduced among them, and to extricate themselves from the state that was tiresome only for the weak, the strong, who were the masters, consented to serve the weak and to submit nature to the law. And the people, who were happy under the empire of violence, exchanged this real happiness for the ideal happiness the laws provide. In recapitulating the different objects that Rousseau proposes for himself in his Discourse on Inequality, we find that he wrote his book to know, 1. What the human race would have become after its creation if there had not been a creator. 2. To distinguish in the human constitution what comes from the divine will from what comes from the human will. Excuse me. 3. To form for himself just ideas and to give a perfect description of a state that never existed. And 4, finally, and this is precisely what the question is about, to know by what sequence of marvels the violence that was impossible in the state of nature could force men to leave this state, and how people possessing real felicity under the empire of violence could resolve to abdicate it to enjoy the repose of an idea under the hard and insupportable reign of law. Let none say that to ridicule Rousseau I have put something of mine into this short resume. If these are not his express words, this is the sense of them. Okay. Alright. I don't agree. I think, actually, to his credit a little bit, the Maestre's put a lot of himself in there. I think he's sort of conceded by sort of a negative acknowledgement a lot of Rousseau's points. By asking rhetorical questions, the answer to which could be yes. In fact, is yes, as we now know. But, yeah, okay. So this is the essence of Rousseau's argument de Maestre's Rousseau's argument. The best way to refute this so-called philosopher is to analyze him and translate him into philosophical language. Then we are surprised we have ever been able to give him a moment's attention. So-called philosopher. That's a little bit interesting. So, Rousseau was a philosopher. This brings to mind that statement by Marx: the philosophers have hitherto only succeeded in describing the world, the point is to change it. If indeed, and this Rousseau's historical argument here seems to be in support of the Hegelian that Hegelian phrase that the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, that we're always one step behind history, that we're always just describing what has already passed. Because we are changing constantly historically. We aren't actually knowing ourselves. We are knowing what we just were, if we're lucky. This, in a sense, is to do Rousseau a very great service, because, in a sense, he's either a philosopher of the future, or he is moving beyond philosophy into something a little bit more, He's moving into an activity where you start to become free, and you start to actually deliberately chart the future and not simply reify what you thought was your original thought that was handed down to you. Because, of course, this is one of the major critiques of Hegel's concept of the state, is that his concept of the ideal state is simply an idealized form of the Prussian state. It's not actually a future state that we go into. It's an imagined variation on a state that already exists. Which is, of course, also what Plato and Aristotle do in varying degrees. Aristotle more so than Plato. The source of his errors, in any case, was in the spirit of his century, to which he paid tribute without perceiving it. What he had in particular was an excessive character that always led him to exaggerate his opinions. With other writers, error advances slowly and hides its approach, but with Rousseau it has no modesty. His foolish ideas of independence and liberty led him to regret the condition of animals and to look for the true destination of man in the absence of all morality. He represents men in their natural state, forced, naked, and without weapons, to defend their lives and their prey against other wild beasts. In this state, children remain bound to the father only as long as they need him for self-preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond dissolves. The children, exempt from the obedience they owed the father, and the father, exempt from the care he owed the children, all return equally to independence. So this is kind of interesting, actually, because one of the things you can definitely critique our contemporary world for, in a lot of places anyways, is that families do not actually support each other, that every generation is alienated from the previous generation and starts from scratch. There isn't an accumulation of wealth. There are very few families actually, join together to actually pool their resources and grow and do better in the next generation. We're sort of returned to a state of nature in that respect, as Rousseau sees it. Which is not to say I like the idea, by the way, of having to have your parents live with you in their old age. That sounds incredibly awkward, but, Shouldn't be forgetting them either, I think. As for the union of the sexes, his appetite satisfied, the man no longer needs a given woman, nor the woman a given man. Of course, the stress is always on the man in this case. The man has not the least concern, nor perhaps the least idea of the consequences of his action. One goes off in one direction, the other in another, and there is no likelihood that at the end of 9 months they have any memory of having known each other. For this kind of memory, by which one individual gives preference to another for the act of procreation, requires more progress or corruption in human understanding than can be supposed in man in the state of animality in question here. Every honest reader who has some idea of the dignity of his nature is at first revolted by these absurd depravities, but soon pity prevails over anger, and he is content to say, "Happy in its time for 100 good reasons would Geneva have been had it possessed little houses, and if a wise tutor had in this dwelling, by the advice of relatives, locked him up early." One can imagine only 2 ways of knowing man's destination, history and anatomy. The first shows what he has always been. The second shows how his organs correspond to his destination and certify it. I think we're going to leave off here. We'll come back to this in a couple of days, maybe tomorrow. We'll see. We'll see if I've been numbed by the dentist and I'm unable to do so. But we've been saved by the slim dotted line. This is a following section. This indicates several blank pages. I don't know why there are so many blank pages. Were de Maestre's works lost for a time? That's a little bit strange. 64. At this point, there are 1.5 pages blank pages in the manuscript. Yeah, strange. We'll just consider this last section here. Right, so the point Rousseau is making is that there isn't even the social stability of monogamy, right? You have partners sort of randomly as opportunity allows, and then you disappear in different directions. No, hang on. Here's a bit of an absurdity. And I'm not going to actually give this one to de Maestre because he's misread Rousseau terribly so far. So I'm going to have to go back and look at that myself. But in this state, children remained bound to the father. And yet, as for the union of the sexes, one goes off in one direction, the other in another, and there is no likelihood that at the end of 9 months they have any memory of having known each other. So these are different states of nature. These are not the same. Or they can't be the same. Now, there may be a contradiction in Rousseau here, and if indeed there is, and I'll find out in the interim if that is indeed the case, then de Maestre has pointed out a very serious flaw in Rousseau's account. Now, not super important, I think anyways, but nonetheless, that would be an absurdity. Now, to be clear, what we judge here is not the actual science of the matter. We judge the conjecture that Rousseau is making, the narrative that he's spinning, and the implications of it, and whether or not de Maestre has accurately or appropriately derived his reading from what Rousseau actually wrote. But this is excellent timing because I feel myself about to about to start coughing away. So. They forget each other in 9 months. What does that mean? What Rousseau means in this context is that in a state of nature, human beings sort of like mate again opportunistically, but they don't stay with each other. They do so kind of randomly. They're not monogamous, and so they might do so with strangers or always with strangers. And then when they cease to, need that interaction, they go off on their own way. So, over the span of 9 months, they probably forget each other completely. Now, that seems to directly contradict the previously quoted section. Actually, the sections here are quoted directly, so we can see if they're close together. I see. Interesting. So he is quoting from two different books. So that could be a problem. This first quote is from the... Actually, I recognize this one. I recognize this quote because I cited it in my response to the academic agent's smear piece on Rousseau. This first quote up here, "Children remain bound to the father," that's from the Social Contract. That's a later text, a much later text. The second quote down here is from the Discourse on Inequality. Let me get some water quickly, 1 sec. All right. Yeah. So these are quotes from two different books. So they are incompatible. I would want to see in the context of the social contract if he actually makes reference to this. Otherwise, this strikes me as a development of his thought, or if he again maintains the same contradicting statements. But I don't think Rousseau is committed to stick to the account he gives in the Discourse on Inequality in the Social Contract. I think these are different books written at different times. I think his thought can evolve in that time. So, the Maestre is being a little bit slippery here. But yeah, if indeed... Now, here's the thing. If he has access to both of these books, and he has read them clearly because he has the quotations, then I don't see why he's quoting from two separate books. Because again, these may be referring to different states of nature. Or not even necessarily a state of nature. It could be referring to a more primitive form of society. Or a more primitive community. Because in the first case, that is of course presuming the household. Children are bound to the father. But clearly in a state of nature, if males and females do not interact after copulating and reproducing, and don't even recognize each other, then clearly children can never be bound to the father because they don't even know who the father is most of the time. I half remember something that would suggest that the typical human pair bonding in a state of nature is around 10 years. That's interesting. It's more than 9 months, though. Alright, well. My throat is now going, and we are at about an hour and 40 minutes, so I'm going to call it here. Let's remember where we're starting off. It is at page 21 when we come back to this. And yeah, so thanks everybody for going through this with me. We'll continue this at a later date. Take care.